Hey there, Bible Tan. Welcome to Holy Week, and welcome to the last week before we start up Easter break. And so I've got some things for you today. Hopefully, at this point, you've already started on that warm up, which is explained in the lesson plans and in the assignment. Again, if you're ever looking for assignments, if it's a warm up, it'll be here in the warm up tab, probably at the bottom. And if it's an exit ticket, it'll be here in the exit ticket tab, probably at the bottom. So things that we got going on today, we have one warm up, we have one assignment in the middle, and one exit ticket, and we have this screencast. So let's just dive right into the lesson. As I mentioned in an email to you guys, there won't be the normal end of class, I guess, like conference time. Typically, depending on the class, there's only like one or two of you who showed up anyway. And while I enjoy and appreciate that, if you guys have any specific questions, email me and we can either set up a conference time where I can answer them in the emails. The reason I'm doing it this way is because, as I mentioned in that email I sent out today or yesterday for you, I have a 5-day-old daughter. And so things are a little like having a fixed time where I'm just going to be sitting waiting for you to come into the window. It's a little less feasible. So if I know that you have questions or need to meet, then email me and I'd be happy to talk with you and guide you through some stuff. Also, for those of you who are falling behind on work, just so you know, there is grace. And so I would be happy to give you credit if you just do those assignments and let me know that you did them. As we move forward, grace will get thinner and thinner just because we should be picking up how the system works. But in the meantime, as you guys are figuring it out, don't worry, just send me any late work that you've missed. All right, here we go. The reason that I did this warm-up about understanding the Bible, just in case you haven't done it, it's the books of the Bible were written between 1900 and 3,000 years ago. Listed at least three things a person should take into consideration before analyzing, judging, or evaluating the contents of such an ancient document. I just want you to think, like, imagine if you're watching a TV show from the 1950s or 1960s. Think about how many cultural references, how many assumptions about what is good and bad and cool and not cool. Think about even the language that's used. How much of that is going to be radically different just from like maybe 60 years or 70 years time in between us and them. And then I want you to multiply that so that we're 1900 to 3,000 years apart. And not only that, in a totally different culture, right? Like if you grew up in America and you were watching American sitcoms, you still kind of get like the American references. The shows are in your language. This might even be an easier post for some of our international students who come from a different culture, right? Because you've had to learn that there are some considerations that you need to take into consideration when interacting with a different culture. And so if you think about it, the Bible was written by people in another culture thousands of years ago. And so that being said, when we read scripture, we need to take that into consideration. So if you haven't done the post yet, go ahead and pause and do that post. Go. Okay, if you have already done it, spoilers, here's some things that you need to take into consideration. One, you need to take into consideration the language. You need to take into consideration the moral, ethical assumptions of a society. You need to take into consideration the cultural context. You need to take into consideration the politics of the day. You need to take into consideration the religions of the day. You need to take into consideration all of these different things as you read this ancient document. The reason that we're talking about this is because after reading a lot of your assignments from Matthew chapter 5, I realized that we needed to address two of the sections. Now, for the most part, you guys kind of understood what Jesus was doing in Matthew chapter 5, but there were two that kept coming up over and over again that I felt like needed some clarification. And so the two sections are Jesus's commands on lust and his commands on divorce. Now, before we even get into this, let's clarify. Remember, Jesus is not giving us a new law. And even like if we go back to our warm-up post, when he says law, he's not talking about the legal system of the day that throws people into jail. One person even said people will end up in jail if they do this. Jesus isn't talking about that kind of law. He's talking about a moral law, about understanding what is right and wrong, right? And so he's comparing it to the Jewish law that was written by Moses about even a thousand or 2,000, between 1 and 2,000 years before him. So if that's the case, he's reinterpreting what the Jewish religious structure deemed was good and what God wanted. And so he's redefining that, but he's not giving a new law saying, here's some new rules to follow, but rather, let's look at the internal condition of your heart. If that's not abundantly clear, I feel like I said it 8,000 times a couple weeks ago. So hopefully it's clear now. Now, that being said, when Jesus makes his comments on lust and adultery, it's really important that we make some definitions. Now, I said it in the video, but I feel like it's important to actually explain these things. Now, lust is not the same thing as attraction. Lust and attraction, I think, can get mixed up in our society, but they are not the same thing. Here's one definition. Which do you think this belongs to? We'll do a little matching game. One, a strong sexual desire, a very powerful feeling of wanting something. Is that lust or attraction? That is lust. It's a desire. It's wanting something. It's powerful. It's oftentimes a desire to own or possess something, or to have something that's not rightfully yours, versus attraction, a quality or force of someone or something that tends to pull others in or create interest in the person or thing. And so if someone is physically attractive, if their personality attractive, if they are spiritually attractive, there's something that draws you to that person, something that catches your attention. Attraction can become lust when that draw or that thing that pulls you in changes your mindset, so that then you go from, okay, they're pulling me in, to now I desire them and I want them. That's when attraction can shift into lust. Now, Jesus, what he's condemning in Matthew chapter 5 is not attraction. He's not saying, do not be pulled in by others, or think that people are interesting, or think that people are attractive. He doesn't say that, but he says, if you've lusted, which is like if you've desired them sexually, if you have a very powerful feeling of wanting them in a certain way, then that is what he's cautioning against. We'll do some more matching. Ownership, is that a lust or an attraction feature? Lust desires ownership. What about closeness? See, lust is not about closeness. Attraction is about closeness. Again, it's being pulled in to another person. It's about there's something that draws two people together. Like there's an attraction there, but then it turns into lust when it becomes a desire for something that's not yours. Possession, again, is lust. Admiration, like if there's something that you're like, oh my gosh, this is a very good thing about that person, that is attraction. And so Jesus is not condemning attraction. He's condemning lust. He's not saying you guys need to make sure that you're not attracted to anybody, because how does a person control that? But he is saying, hey, but control what you do in your mind with that attraction. Control the decisions that you make, what you choose to think about in the process. And so here's what he says. You've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery, which is to cheat on one's spouse. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, again, it's important to note that Jesus is talking about adultery here. If you are physically attracted to a person that is your spouse, like your wife or your husband, in a sexual way, that is okay, right? But Jesus is saying if you have those thoughts of desire for someone who is not yours, you've committed adultery. And this is how we know he's talking about not just sex in general, but adultery is when you have sex with someone who is not your spouse. So he's specifically saying, don't do things in your mind with people who you're not married to. And then this is where a lot of people got tripped up. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out, throw it away. If your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for that part to be to lose that part than to be thrown into hell. And Jesus uses these strong words because I think that oftentimes we justify ourselves. People are good at justifying their sin and saying, well, everybody's doing it. It's totally normal. And so I'm just going to go along with this. But Jesus is like, no, don't allow like this thing to continue in your life. Take it very, very seriously to the level of amputation. Now, like I said before, cutting off your hand or gouging out your eye is not actually going to fix a lust problem, because a lust problem happens in your brain. Um, and so I wanted to walk you through maybe like one practical area where lust shows up in our society today, to show you how could a person apply this, um, like apply what Jesus is actually saying here, because he's not being that crazy. And I got some data for you. This is from covenanteyes.org, which is a Christian accountability software think tank. Um, Among teens over here, 90% of teens and 96% of young adults are either encouraging, accepting, or neutral when they talk about porn or pornography with their friends. What this means is that youth culture is very anti-eye gouging and hand cutting, right? They're like, hey, it's totally cool. Now, this statistic is a little different. 55% of adults 25 and older believe it's wrong. Teens and young adults 13 and 24 believe not recycling is worse than viewing pornography, and then 43% of teens believe porn is bad for society versus these other percentages of other. So like when looking at your age demographic, it seems like the teenage generation is not only okay with lust, but okay with like actively pursuing it by consuming media that feeds off of lust. And this is a problem, right? Now, in the church, you'd be like, okay, cool. Well, at least people who are religious or Christians are different, so they don't need to follow Jesus' advice. But false. Even like people who are in ministry, 1 in 5 youth pastors, 1 in 7 senior pastors, almost half of senior pastors and youth pastors say they've struggled with pornography in the past. So there are these staggering statistics that show that like pornography, which is a media, that is made to propagate and increase lust in people, like is even in the church something that people struggle with. People in leadership in the church, and you might be like, well, okay, well, what's the big deal? But there are like actual practical implications. 68% of divorce cases involved internet use to meet a new lover. 56 included obsession with pornographic websites. And 70% of wives of sex addicts could be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. So what this means is that like not only is this commercialized media of lust causing issues, like in shaping perceptions of young people, but it's also destroying marriages. And so if you're like, okay, it ain't no big deal, I would say you're wrong. Like the data shows that that's not true. And so with this area, like I don't think anyone would doubt that like the consumption of this media, of looking at other people either naked or doing things that are sexual, is a form of like you're engaging in lust, and this would be something that Jesus wants you to not do. Because if we clean out that area of your heart, then you're going to be faithful to your spouse. Then your marriage won't fall apart or won't fall apart for at least that reason. You won't commit adultery because you have a clean heart that isn't even lusting. So if that's the case, here's what it looks like to take Jesus's words seriously. So let's say you're a person who struggles with looking at pornography. Then if that's the case, then you amputate, like maybe gouging out your eye or cutting off your hand isn't the way to go, but like maybe you amputate or cut off your freedom with your own device, right? You put restrictions on your phone. You say that you don't take your phone into whatever room it is that you're tempted to watch that media. Or maybe you put security codes and give your parents only the password so that you don't go to certain types of websites. Maybe it amputates privacy. Maybe you say, hey, I'm going to download software on my computer, on my phone, on my iPad that sends my website history to an accountability partner. There's even that software, the people who produce Covenant Eyes, that data, they produce the type of software that like runs in the background of your phone and takes randomized screenshots and scans it to see if you're looking at inappropriate images, and then sends it to an accountability partner. So if that's the case, maybe you have a friend who you can trust, or your mom, or a youth pastor or something that you could say, hey, hold me accountable so I don't do dumb things on my phone or on my device anymore. Or maybe it means amputating certain media. Maybe that person on Instagram that keeps posting things that are that definitely do things inside of you where they're not wearing enough clothes. Maybe you need to unfollow them. Like maybe you need to delete that app on altogether. Maybe it means that you need to make better choices about like the movies that you say, yeah, guys, let's watch this movie. I know there's probably like 3 sex scenes in it, but it's okay. It'll be fine. But instead of putting that stuff in your mind, you do the amputation, you do the cutting off to say, I'm not going to look at that stuff. So some of you were like, okay, well, everybody would be walking around without eyes or hands, but I think that like this is just one example. Now, it's not just pornography that's the issue, but I feel like that's a practical example to like kind of flesh out what Jesus is talking about here. That if you cut, he's not saying cut off your literal hand because that doesn't solve the issue, because the issue of lust is in your mind. But you can cut off things with your device, things with privacy, things with people you follow, things with movies that you watch. Like you can cut those things off. And then, like Jesus's words apply, and then you experience the kingdom because you're free from this destructive force in the world. The other thing that a lot of people were confused about is Jesus's words on divorce. He says, it has been said, anyone who divorces his wife but must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality or cheating makes her the victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Notice here, who is Jesus talking to? Is he talking to wives? No. Think about the warm-up post that we did. Most of the people that Jesus is talking to are men. And the reason is because they lived in a patriarchal society, which is a big fancy word for saying that it was dominated by men in an unjust and unfair way towards women. The society that Jesus lived in was not fair towards women. So if Jesus is going to do something good for women, who does he have to talk to? He has to talk to the men. Now keep that in your mind as you relook at this passage. He's talking to men and saying, okay, you've heard it said before that a man can divorce his wife, right? Just give her a certificate. But I tell you, don't divorce her unless she's cheated on you. Because like, if you divorce her, look at what you're doing to her. You're putting her in a situation where she's become the victim of adultery, where she's been put in a situation where if she remarries, like your souls have been bonded together, and now she's going to have to look for another husband elsewhere, because in an ancient society, a divorced woman is not very kindly looked upon or treated. And so Jesus, by saying, hey, don't get divorces unless it's for sexual immorality, like a lot of the posts said things like, well, what about if it's abuse? Or what if they're like a terrible spouse? Like Jesus is talking to men in a patriarchal society, telling them not to divorce their wives, right? In the ancient world, there wouldn't have been issues of abuse, like, or at least to the audience he's talking to, because women wouldn't abuse their husbands because it wasn't fair like that, right? And so like the idea of like divorce over abuse wouldn't have been something his audience would need to consider because he's talking to men in a male dominated society. So that being said, look at what Jesus is doing. The best way to understand this is it's this thing called a hermeneutic of trajectory, which is just a big fancy word of saying following the trajectory as you interpret scripture. If we go back to the days of Moses, in the Canaanite culture, if you got tired of your wife, you could kill her. You could just send her away and then not take care of her. You could do whatever you wanted because a woman was like property to you. This is the ancient Canaanite culture of like the second millennium BC. Now, if you think about it, what Moses did by saying you have to give a certificate of divorce to a wife actually elevates the status of women in society by saying, okay, there has to be a legal process. You can't just dump a wife because you're tired of her. There has to be a legal document that says that it was you that made this choice to divorce her. And so even if we look back on it and we're like, oh my gosh, only men could do this. Well, it was 3,000 years ago. And compared to the ancient society, that was a huge step up in rights for women, which is, again, if we look at what Jesus is doing here in the Palestinian culture under the Roman Empire, women are still not treated that well. But they had the Mosaic law, this law of Moses in place for a long time. But then Jesus says, okay, not only should you not like make sure that if you divorce properly. But I tell you that just don't divorce her. Like, stick to your commitments unless she's cheated on you. Continue to be her husband and take care of her, husbands. Now, again, you notice that it doesn't give any rights. He's not giving rights to women to say that women, you can divorce your husbands, but because like in the ancient world, that would have been unheard of. But if we follow this trajectory, which means like like you probably heard this in physics class or math class, if you follow the trajectory, you see that where all this is going is towards equality, right? Like he takes the culture at large and then moves up. Take the culture at large and then move up. And so this is why a lot of the pioneers for women's liberation, for liberation of slaves, like have come from Christians who understand this concept that the Bible is moving toward freedom and equality for all people. We even see this in Scripture where Paul says things like there's no longer male nor female, slave nor free, Greek nor Jew. These distinctions are eliminated in Christ. And so Jesus, by doing this, he's saying, men who have used the law to your advantage to divorce people when you're tired of them, no, stick to your commitments and stay with your wife unless she's cheated on you. This is what it's all about. It's not about make sure that you hold yourself in a marriage even though they're a terrible, abusive, awful spouse. But this is about Jesus saying, no, change the part of your heart that tries to manipulate the law into getting what you want, and instead stick to your commitments. If you said that you're going to love her for the rest of your life, then love her for the rest of your life. Hopefully that clears up those two issues, but just to check, there's an assignment called Explain Jesus to Someone Else. I want you to imagine you have a friend who's confused about Jesus' teaching on either lust or divorce, and explain to them what Jesus meant and how this could be practically applied in today's society. So pause and go do that now. Apply what you just learned. Pick one of those topics and pretend that you're talking to Jim Bob or Susie, who doesn't understand why Jesus is saying what he's saying, and be like, here's what he meant. Ready, go. Cool. If we move on, open up your Bibles to Matthew chapter 7. In Matthew chapter 7, Jesus talks about judgment. And he says, do not judge, or you too will be judged. For the same way that you judge, you'll also be judged. When Jesus says judge, I think in modern society, what we mean is, what we think he means is like, don't make any evaluations. Don't make any assessments. Don't check to see if someone is good or bad. But if we look at what Jesus means by this word judge, at the heart of what he's saying is do not condemn, right? He's saying do not like look down on others because of what they do. What I want you to do is just really quickly take some notes for yourself on either a blank piece of paper or on a notability note. I want you to write a list of pet peeves, like things that bother you about other people. This isn't something you submit, but like this will help just like your brain process some of this information. I want you to build a list of personal pet peeves, things that you judge people about the hardest. Like, is it the way they chew, what things that they say, how they dress? Think of the things that you judge people about. Take a couple of seconds just to write down some of those things. Pause this video while you write those things down. Take a minute and write down some of those pet peeves. Once you have that list, I also want you to think of a list of things that you think God might judge you for, or maybe like other people might judge you for, things that might be annoying about you, like things that might be bothersome about you. Do you think other people might be annoyed by you or bothered by you or dislike things about you? You should write that list too. When you have these two lists, I think this is what's at the heart of Jesus's teaching here in Matthew 7, 1 through 5. His teaching is, you'll notice that eventually he uses an analogy, and he says, who are you to pick the speck out of your brother's eye? Who are you to take like the little tiny piece of dust in someone else's eye when you have a huge log hanging out of your own eye? When you have a huge beam of wood hanging out of your eye, who are you to like pick out a little grain of sand? He says, first, take the log out of your own eye so that then you can see clearly to help your brother, right? Then you can see more clearly to help the other person who has something in their eye as well. I don't think that Jesus is saying you should never make any judgments or assessments, right? Because think about it, like otherwise, everything that he just did in Matthew chapter 5, isn't that a judgment to say that it's bad to divorce, it's bad to lust, it's bad to murder, it's bad, like, isn't that judging? Like, clearly it's okay to judge and say some things are wrong in certain circumstances. But what Jesus's point is that whenever you're judging, and we'll just like have that be a representation of this first list that you did, that list of pet peeves. Whenever you're judging another person, Jesus is reminding us, hey, keep in mind that this other list also exists, right? As you judge others, remember that there are things that you ought to be judged for as well. And if you have those things in your mind, then you can approach other people humbly, right? You can say, you know what, I have struggles too, but I see that there's something in your eye. Like, can we like work together on each other's eyes so that way we can become better people? Can we like remove the issues that we have together? And when we approach it through humility, then it's more palatable. And you'll notice that his whole point is like, it's not about ignoring the other person's faults, but it's like when you see them, to remember that you have faults as well, and to not condemn them for those faults, but be thankful for the grace that God shows you and that other person. Also, if you think about it, when we judge people, one of the things that often is occurring in our hearts is we're judging other people because we don't like what they do, and we don't like what they do, and we want them to stop it. And so when we condemn other people, when we gossip about them for not being as good as us, or when we try to make them feel bad about themselves, oftentimes it's an attempt to control other people, to get them to stop that behavior, to make them act more like we want them to make them act more like us. It's a way of trying to control them. And the reason that I bring this up is because Jesus's next point about not casting pearls before swine is directly connected to this. Now, I don't think any of you is tempted to throw pearls or jewelry to pigs. That's probably not something that you struggle with. You're not probably not like staying up late at night, like wondering if you're going to be able to fight the temptation of throwing pearls to pigs. However, I think that a lot of you probably do throw pearls to pigs, because this connects with the judgment passage in the following way. The judgment passage, we try to control other people through negative enforcement. We try to control other people by treating them badly, thinking of them badly, and pointing out their flaws and faults. Jesus then moves into, okay, sometimes we try to control people by doing the opposite. Sometimes we throw pearls to people that don't want pearls. Sometimes we give good things to people because we want to control people. We judge people because we want to control them. Sometimes we give good things to people that can't appreciate them because we want to control them. This has been one of those things as a teacher that I've had to learn, is that no matter how much I try to force you to like Jesus, I can't force you. Like, I can't make it happen, right? No matter how many pearls I throw to you, I can't make you appreciate the pearls. And what Jesus is doing here with the judgment passage and the pearls before swine, or the sacred things to dogs passage, is he's saying, he's extending what he did in Matthew chapter 6. At the end of Matthew chapter 6, he's like, don't worry. Be a non-anxious, non-worrisome presence in the world. And he says, don't worry about trying to control your food and your drink and your clothing situation. And then he moves into Matthew chapter 7. Remember, this is all one sermon. And it naturally connects, because he's like, okay, don't worry about that. And don't worry about people either, right? Like, do your best to help people with their specs, and do your best to like hand out what's good. But like, you can't control people. I think you've probably seen so many examples of parenting where like a kid gets or even if you've seen the Harry Potter trilogy, Dudley is totally spoiled by his parents, but it doesn't make him stop being a pig. Right? It's not being spoiled. It's not being given pearls. It's not being given nice things that make us better people. It's something that has to happen inside of us to change that perspective. And so Jesus says, don't control people through negative reinforcement, and don't try to control people through positive reinforcement. You can't throw pearls at a pig and expect it to change. Be a non-anxious presence in the world. So that's your exit ticket. I want you to think about these two methods of trying to control people. And I want you to think about what's a bigger temptation for you: to pull planks out of other people's eyes and try to control them by judging them or like pointing out their flaws and pulling things out of their eyes? Or is it a bigger temptation to you to like throw pearls to people who don't want pearls, to throw sacred things to people who don't want sacred things? And I want you to think about what would it look like practically for you to try to give up trying to control people in that way. So if you're try to control people by being nice to them, or try to control people by being mean to them, what would it practically look like for you to give that up? And instead, just do the right thing. Right? Instead, just do what Jesus says after this passage: is do unto others what you would want them to do to you. So that's our close for today. Do that exit ticket, and then you're all done for the day. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Bye.